I think one of the key debates that's come up the last couple of days, and that's a general debate as well, is the balance between what we might call intensive risk, the very serious, significant events that cause substantial damage to livelihoods, loss of life, damage to property, loss of valuable things, and how that balances with the extensive risk to things that affect people on a day-to-day basis. The differences between them in the extent that they can be observed, because of course extensive risk is very small. It's a very significant loss for individual households, a very significant loss for families. But in the grand scheme of things, where we're looking at the global media, where we're looking at the way in which big events get reported, these things often get forgotten. And one of the significant things we have to try and engage with in the risk debates is how to appropriately recognize the consequences both of extensive risk, these big events, and intensive risk, these multiple small events. How we measure the consequences of them, how we then develop policy responses and practical responses that address both these extensive and intensive risks. One of the ways I think is helpful is to think about the deficits that exist, both deficits in terms of the provision of the basic services, the basic requirements for life, the infrastructure that's deemed necessary and appropriate to keep people nourished, to keep people healthy, and ideally to keep people happy as well. And recognizing that in many places there are substantial deficits in these areas. So before we can begin to think about reducing some of the risks, we also need to think about addressing some of these underlying concerns. And of course, many of these underlying concerns also shape the risk context, that where there is inadequate management of solid waste, and we have conditions in which drains are blocked, in which there's more frequent flooding, where there are conditions in which the basic public health infrastructure is inadequate. We have conditions where there's a potential for rapid spread of epidemics following any particular kind of disruption to the norm through an extreme event of some type. And so the risk and the development frameworks have to be linked very closely. And I think that works in several ways. The interventions to address development concerns need also to take risk adequately into account. And that's one of the things that both government interventions, the funding from international development banks and international agencies, the activities of civil society and NGOs have often put things to ameliorate some of these development deficits in place without adequately taking into account how these might be affected by particular kinds of shocks and stresses. Similarly, though, the activities that are put in place to manage risk, to manage the potential harm to lives and well-being and livelihoods, are going to be more effective and long-lasting when they also have a component that addresses some of the everyday needs. In fact, that's one of the strongest conclusions from the IPCC Special Report on Extreme Events, that the risk-reducing activities that address present-day development needs are more likely to be sustained and maintained and effective in the long term. And I often talk about an example of that I saw in the Dominican Republic, an evacuation staircase that was constructed to help people get from the shores of an estuary up a very steep slope to safety at times of storms, high tides or hurricanes. And that evacuation staircase is very well maintained, ready for use in an emergency, because it serves an everyday need. It's the way in and out of the community. It's the route along which commerce takes place. It's the route along which people go to work, along which children go to school. And so it meets a very important, immediate everyday need, and it meets an important need for reducing risk at times of particular shocks or stress. There's a common issue which links disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and climate change mitigation, which of course in the climate change discussions simply means the reducing atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases. And that common metric is risk, because reducing the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is a means of managing risk. It is of preventing unmanageable changes in the world's climate, preventing unmanageable future changes that will disrupt ecosystems, that will disrupt urban systems, that will disrupt agricultural systems. Adaptation to climate change is also about managing risk. It's about managing the unavoidable effects of climate change in ways that means that these changes have less significant effects on these different systems. And of course, disaster risk reduction by its very name is about managing risk. It's about managing the risks that come about from particular disaster events. So thinking in common about a risk management framework, which is one of the things we've been discussing the last couple of days, is one way in which we can keep on track in making sure that interventions in one area or the other can contribute to all of these and can also contribute to some of the goals of sustainability, some of the goals of economic development, and some environment and development goals more generally. The differences, though, do need to be stressed. A focus only on disaster risk reduction won't address the drivers of climate change, the emissions of greenhouse gases. A narrowly defined focus on disaster risk reduction that uses past records and past frequency of events is going to be inadequate in the future because of the consequences of climate change. So these differences needed to be taken into account, but there's threads that can work across them. The one other area that I think is worth stressing is whether we can think of ways in which the global attention to climate change can be used as an opportunity to meet some of the broader goals we're trying to accomplish on risk reduction more generally. At the moment, financing for climate change is inadequate. There are challenges to do with its accessibility to the most vulnerable groups, but at least there is a framework being put in place. There are dedicated funds from levies on the Clean Development Mechanism that are meant to be available for direct access by some of the most vulnerable countries to address climate risk. There is a new Green Climate Fund that's just been set up. The modalities for how that operates are still being discussed. And whilst there's a strong focus, particularly in the initial discussions at the Green Climate Fund, that these do have to be climate change responses that are funded, in the same way that we can talk about how development and risk reduction activities can complement each other, I think it's imperative on those people who have perhaps worked more narrowly in the disaster risk reduction community to consider the ways in which some of the activities and the funding to support these for climate adaptation can contribute to disaster risk reduction goals as well. Adopting the term resilience was a positive move. It was a reflection that adaptation in the climate change context was something which was inadequate because we couldn't know fully what we were going to have to adapt to. And resilience was a genuine, well-intentioned effort to think more about some of the drivers of risk and how those could be addressed, thinking about some of the inherent characteristics of ecosystems, of human systems, of individuals and households. So in that regard, I think it's a very positive effort to try and take a more holistic approach. The challenge, I think, is a challenge that we face with using lots of metaphors when they become applied to human systems. As a metaphor of bouncing back to a pre-existing state, it's inadequate. Yeah, we live in a world where there are millions of deaths because of preventable deaths from poor quality water supply, poor quality sanitation, from diseases like malaria. And of course, we don't want low and middle income countries, and particularly we don't want people living in low income settlements to bounce back just to a condition where they're still very susceptible to these kinds of diseases, these kinds of things that harm their well-being and that prevent them from living long, happy, rewarding lives. So if we are to talk about resilience, we need to think about how we use it in a way that has perhaps a more transformative element. The word that we've used a couple of times over the last days has been to think about flourishing. How do we move just beyond bouncing back to the previous state, which isn't adequate, particularly in many low-income countries, to a state that is flourishing? At the same time, we need to perhaps, there is a challenge to more wealthy countries and more wealthy people as well, recognizing that perhaps the current state of lives is not sustainable. We cannot have everybody having the levels of consumption, the levels of wealth that we observe in lots of Europe, in lots of North America. So for some people, resilience might actually be at a less high standard of consumption and life. We may need to think about ways of constraining the consumption of the most wealthy if we're going to achieve sustainability goals as well as risk reduction goals. That's a difficult question. I think that the way in which we conceive of what is necessary for a fulfilled life may be at the root of it. We've been, again, trying to think about what the outcomes are that we would wish to accomplish from the next Hyogo framework for action. What do we want to achieve? Do we want more resilient societies? Do we want longer lives? Do we want people to have more fulfilled lives? And I think that there's probably something that needs tying up around the different elements of what we want to achieve for people, for families, households, for communities, that recognizes that different people are different people have different aims, different people require different things to be fulfilled. But thinking about the outcome, the ultimate outcome of what we want to achieve and how that links to individual lives. I think we have to be careful that what we expect out of these kinds of global reports more generally. I mean, a report alone is not going to change the world. What I think these reports can do is act as critical points around which we can distill some of the key areas for action by some of the key stakeholders. And I think that the challenge is to get some of these messages sufficiently succinct that they can be broadly understood, to try not to be too prescriptive because of the recognition of the different contexts in which the ideas need to be implemented, yet still to be sufficiently ambitious. And I mean, the balance between achievability and ambition is always a very difficult one to strike. We need something that we can aim for. We need something that speaks not only to a narrow community of people working on risk and resilience, but that speaks to the influential ministries in government systems, speaks to the finance ministries, speaks to the planning ministries. And we need something that speaks to people at different levels of government as well. The ISDR has made great strides in engaging with local governments, recognizing the actions that local governments need to take to reduce risk. There are many areas in which local government activities are central. And I think that these assessment reports, we haven't always been as good as we should be at getting the message to the places where it really matters, where implementation has to take place. So I think that's perhaps another challenge, making sure that the messages can be taken at different levels of government and acted on at different levels of government. One of the things that we've begun to talk about that sticks with me is thinking about for whom are we trying to implement these activities. And I think that a message would be to ask these questions, not just in an abstract sense, but who is affected, why are they affected, whose resilience can be strengthened, how can it be strengthened. And I think that as we look at some of the changing global demographic patterns, the shift to more urban societies, the recognition of the extent of urban poverty and marginalization, thinking about the way in which these messages around risk, resilience, response can be applied to people whose voices particularly haven't been heard, who aren't vocal. And so thinking more generally as well then about how to ensure that these voices and perspectives are adequately represented, both in the way we conceptualize the issues and in the way that we respond to them.